I'm delighted to be joined today by Michael Fiddy, who is the co-lead of the firm's global restructuring group. This is going to be a slightly strange session today because, Michael, we've known each other for over 20 years. And in fact, restructuring is also my specialism. So I'm going to concentrate on doing my job of just asking the questions and leave you to the answers, and I'll try not to butt in. So can we kick off today's session just asking an open question, which is, how has the Ukraine crisis impacted the restructuring market?
It's had a significant impact in certain areas, but it's impacted different businesses in different ways. Those that were significantly impacted by the sanctions originally have had a crisis management process and had to go into some forms of processes to be dealt with. Others have been impacted more generally through trading, and people are having a look at those. It hasn't really played out. They're analysing their position. And others are looking at how it's impacting them more generally in the environment, which they've already got tough headwinds they're dealing with at the moment.
Okay, and in this country, so we're sat in London now, so in this jurisdiction, it's sort of come on the back of Brexit, and then we've had 2 and a bit years of a global pandemic. So how is this issue in Ukraine sort of different or exacerbating that? How's it different, say, to the COVID-19 pandemic?
The COVID-19 pandemic was a bizarre set of circumstances for the restructuring market where everyone thought there'd be a significant impact and businesses would really struggle. But businesses demonstrate incredible resilience to deal with the problems they had. And also the support measures from the government were huge. And so you didn't see the crisis that everyone expected. There was also a sense of togetherness, common will, and people understood the problem they were in. Everyone was in it together. I do think this is different because the government measures and the statutes have been wound back significantly, and actually the businesses were beginning to look at dealing with those. Then we were getting further headwinds of inflation and the other factors, and the Ukraine crisis just exacerbated all of those across the whole of the market. Obviously, it's different for certain other businesses that are more directly impacted, but the Ukraine crisis, I think, is just accelerating a lot of problems that businesses had in any event.
Okay, and then looking specifically, in this series, we've talked previously about sanctions. Specifically talking on sanctions, are they having an impact into the restructuring market?
Again, the areas where it's been, specifically hit them and sanctioned businesses were no longer able to trade. Then we've seen procedures used to take control of those businesses and deal with the problems that they've had. But there have been also more sort of subtle areas as well, is that people are a lot more cognizant of the sanctions regimes, so they're having to spend a lot more time thinking about that. And anything that creates inefficiencies in those businesses, it creates problems for anyone. So they're having to review that. That's costing money. And other factors, like the businesses that people are dealing with, particularly the sanctioned ones, often are struggling to get advice. So if you've got a participant in any restructuring environment who isn't able to get good quality advice, doesn't know the pathway through, it makes it more difficult for everybody in that circumstance.
Okay, and then can we just chat about sectors? So before the COVID pandemic, we and everybody else in our market used to sort of focus on distressed sectors and then narrow down to names and businesses within set sectors. And then through COVID, you've already said there's this feeling of togetherness, right? We're all in the same boat. So it's kind of everything, nothing avoided the impact. But now with Ukraine, are there particular sectors that we think are going to be adversely impacted?
Yeah, I think that what we've seen, again, possibly an acceleration of these things. We saw the challenges in the energy sector, and that was, again, increase in pricing and uncertainty driven by lots of factors. That, as I say, has been exacerbated. The other ones which probably have been impacted most are the agricultural sectors, and particularly, say, with Ukraine, wheat, and also things like potash, which are used for fertilizer and things. So there's been dislocation there, and people are scrabbling around to try and fill those holes. If you look at both of those things, that has a knock-on on just about everything, right? And particularly, I think the increase in energy prices on businesses that are large consumers of electricity and power. So you're looking at from the metal industry to other circumstances.
Paper, chemicals, I think.
Paper and chemicals and things like that, which are going to erode margin significantly. And whether or not it is possible for those companies to be able to pass on those costs to the consumer will be interesting to and see their survival. We're certainly hearing stories of businesses almost shutting down because it's currently uneconomic for them to produce under their current business model. So they're going to have to address those crises as they come through. But that also is played into increases in labour costs and everything else. So it's all about inflation and trying to keep that under control and see where the business is going in light of those headwinds.
And are there geographical differences at play here?
Hugely, and for different factors. I think you'd broadly look at it and say that the closer you are to Russia and Ukraine, the worse it is, certainly on the European side. But there are the other factors as to how dependent you are on the oil and gas, how the sanctions have affected you particularly. And then there's legal regimes and things like that which will affect people differently.
And people will have seen a lot in the press supply chain issues, which that's been going on for a long time. There's tons of reasons that that's the case, probably exacerbated by Ukraine. But how do you see those issues playing through?
Again, in some ways, a lot of this is too early to tell. We saw, again, great resilience of dealing with the supply chain crisis during the COVID problems. And as you say, this has exacerbated it. But some of these might be more structural, and certain things are really difficult to replace. And so you're looking at supply chain issues which may not recover and have to be rebuilt. And certainly if you're looking at the oil and gas sector, say, for example, that needs significant change in supply routes as well as just actually the supply chain. And so that's driving up prices. It's affecting different sectors in different ways, and buying power is important in those areas. But generally, shipping costs are still high, possibly come off a little bit from the peak of the cost, but that's putting pressure on the businesses. And again, I come back to the question of, can you really push that onto the consumer?
And so with all these macro issues then going on, what should companies and businesses be thinking about doing? What sort of tools are available for them in the restructuring context?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, I think, is the developments that have happened probably since the financial crisis. Governments across the world have been ensuring that their restructuring mechanisms are fit for purpose. Probably before the financial crisis, the processes were in some ways a bit draconian. There were proper insolvencies and those sorts of regimes that were difficult to use, and they were mechanisms for just closing the business down. Certainly across Europe and Asia now, you've got a lot more sophisticated restructuring regimes which are built to give the company a second chance. There's recently been legislation across Europe, directive which had to come into force, I think, in July this year, which means that all the European countries have to have a sort of second chance regime. And you've seen, I think, certainly in the UK, you've got the restructuring plan that's come in. That's been tested relatively well in the courts now and has been shown to be pretty effective. There's issues about cost and how that's going to go. I think that perhaps across Europe, the interesting thing will be whether the courts are geared up to deal with the potential volume that's coming. But the general rule of thumb, I say, is don't bury their head in the sand. Get some advice from some people who deal with restructuring to see what the options are. The greatest thing is to get the advice and realise that you don't need to deal with it and that you're doing well. And I think that's, again, something which we'll see slightly differently. The directors were able to rely upon this sort of sentiment of everyone in it together. Whereas I think this time, with all the headwinds that are going on, there's a bigger risk of lack of support. And so therefore being on top of these issues, thinking about the processes properly, documenting that you are taking those processes and the right decisions for the right reasons is probably more important.
And I think you probably answered the question I was going to ask to an extent, which is for the directors themselves, this is really challenging to sort of, manoeuvre your way through and navigate through. So is there anything particular as individuals, as boards, they should be doing to protect themselves?
Yeah, I think, it varies as to what the duties are from country to country. But in broad terms, we like to use the idea that, you need to be able to see light at the end of the tunnel, and you need to have the gas to get you there, that you have sufficient money in the tank, you have a business plan that actually can get you to the light at the end of the tunnel, and that's reasonable. Now, how do you demonstrate that that's reasonable? You have good discussions in your board meetings, you have the appropriate information in front of you. And so in these challenging environments, it's about getting a plan, getting, where necessary, appropriate advice to give you the information presented in the right way that's credible, engagement with stakeholders at an early stage with a clear plan as to what you are going to do to make the business viable and succeed going forward.
And we always say recording everything.
I think that's absolutely critical.
And are there any other factors? We've touched on sanctions. Is there anything else that's making restructuring and sort of navigating all this more challenging in the current environment?
I think there's a number of things. One is the changing legal environment, which is out there. I think that the increased interest rates, which we will have and having at the moment, are likely to continue to rise. That makes it more difficult. We haven't really seen inflationary pressures and dealing with those in this way for possibly 15, 20 years. And dealing with those is a very different environment for restructuring people to deal with. Possibly and probably a tightening on the availability of capital, because we've seen since the financial crisis a lot of problems being solved by capital being redeployed. So if that's not available, then people might need to get into the nitty-gritty a bit more, look at the viability of their business.
And Michael, just to close off today, what would be your key takeaways for clients that are watching?
I think the key thing is that people who are successful in businesses often are optimists. That's why they're successful in business, because they have a vision, have a view about how things are going to be successful. And dealing with things going badly isn't necessarily the strong point. Restructuring professionals are used to dealing with things that are dealing badly, dealing with real facts, knowing how to present that to the other stakeholders in a way that's persuasive, the timing of that engagement with the relevant stakeholders. So the crucial thing, I think, is to get experts in who know what they're talking about, who can help guide through that process and work with you to decide what you need to do.